A fresh start in Willow Creek. James Wallace pulled up to the small, unassuming house at the end of Maple Drive. It wasn't much. A modest two-bedroom ranch-style home with white shutters and a well-kept lawn. But it was his. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of belonging, though he was cautious not to get too comfortable too quickly. Experience had taught him that trust, especially in a new place, wasn't freely given. James stepped out of his car, stretching his legs after the long drive from his old apartment 2 towns over. He had spent the better part of the past week coordinating his move while simultaneously juggling his responsibilities as the newly appointed police chief of Willow Creek. The promotion was a big deal, not just for him, but for the town itself. Willow Creek had never had a black police chief before, and while most residents welcomed the change, James knew not everyone would see his appointment as a positive step. Dressed in a crisp button-up shirt and dark jeans, James began unloading boxes from his car. Each box contained pieces of his life, books, pictures, and memorabilia from his days in the academy. As he worked, he noticed the neighborhood around him. It was quiet, idyllic even, with kids riding bikes and neighbors chatting casually in their driveways. It was exactly the kind of place he had hoped to find, a peaceful retreat from the chaos of his demanding job. Across the street, a curtain shifted. James glanced up just in time to catch a woman's silhouette at the window of the house opposite his. The curtain fell back into place quickly, but James felt the familiar twinge of suspicion. He'd grown accustomed to people watching him, sizing him up, trying to figure out if he belonged. He shrugged it off and continued unloading his belongings, determined not to let paranoia ruin his day. Inside the house across the street, Margaret Thompson stood by the window, her brows furrowed. Margaret had lived in Willow Creek for over 20 years, and she took great pride in knowing everyone in the neighborhood. Newcomers were rare, and when they did arrive, they usually introduced themselves promptly. But this man hadn't knocked on anyone's door or stopped to chat with the neighbors. To Margaret, that was unusual. Something about him felt out of place, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Maybe it was the way he moved with quiet confidence, or perhaps it was because he didn't look like the kind of person she was used to seeing on Maple Drive. Margaret prided herself on being observant, and her instincts told her something was off. She debated for a moment before picking up her phone. "Hi, this is Margaret Thompson," she said, her voice a mix of nervousness and resolve. "There's a man across the street from me. He's unloading boxes, but I don't recognize him. And, well, he doesn't look like he belongs here. Could you send someone to check it out?" The dispatcher on the other end assured her that an officer would be sent to investigate. Margaret hung up, feeling both relieved and uneasy. She told herself she was doing the right thing, looking out for her neighborhood. But deep down, a small voice whispered that her actions might not be as justified as she wanted to believe. James was halfway through unpacking when he heard the distant sound of sirens. He paused, his hands resting on the edge of a box, and listened. The sirens grew louder, their urgency slicing through the otherwise tranquil afternoon. He looked up just in time to see 2 patrol cars turn onto Maple Drive and come to a stop directly in front of his house. 2 officers stepped out of the vehicles, their body language tense but professional. James straightened his posture, his years of training kicking in. He approached the officers calmly, his hands visible and his expression neutral. "Good afternoon," James said, his voice steady. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" One of the officers, a young man with a neatly trimmed beard, looked at James, his eyes narrowing slightly. "We received a call about suspicious activity in the area," he said. "Do you live here?" James fought the urge to sigh. He could already guess where this was going. "Yes, I do. I just moved in today." The other officer, older and more seasoned, glanced at the open trunk of James's car, where boxes were stacked neatly. "Can we see some identification, sir?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. James nodded and reached slowly into his pocket for his wallet. He handed over his driver's license, along with his badge. "I think this might clear things up," he said, watching their reactions closely. The younger officer's face reddened as he read the name on the badge. Chief James Wallace. He glanced at his partner, who looked equally uncomfortable. There was a long pause as they processed the situation. "You're the new police chief?" the younger officer asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "That's right," James replied. "I officially started last week. Today's my moving day." The older officer handed back the badge and license, his expression a mix of embarrassment and apology. "I'm sorry about this, Chief. We didn't know." James smiled faintly, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of irritation. "No harm done," he said, keeping his tone even. "But I'd like to know what prompted this visit." The younger officer hesitated before responding. "We received a call from a neighbor about suspicious activity." James nodded slowly. "I see. Well, I think it's safe to say there's no issue here. But I'd like to speak with the person who made that call." The officers exchanged a glance before gesturing toward Margaret's house. James followed their gaze and saw the curtain twitch again. He sighed inwardly, already preparing himself for what was sure to be an uncomfortable conversation. Inside her house, Margaret watched the scene unfold with growing unease. She had expected the police to handle the situation quietly, but now she realized the man across the street wasn't just any newcomer. He was the new police chief. Her stomach churned as she saw James glance toward her window. She ducked out of sight, her heart pounding. How could she explain herself? What would she say? Before she could decide, there was a knock at her door. Margaret hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Finally, she opened it to find James standing on her porch, his expression calm but serious. "Mrs. Thompson, I presume," he said politely. Margaret nodded, her face flushed with shame. "Yes, that's me," she murmured. "I believe you made a call about me earlier," James said, his tone measured. "I'd like to discuss that." Margaret wrung her hands nervously. "I'm so sorry," she stammered. "I didn't know who you were, and I thought." James held up a hand, cutting her off gently. "Mrs. Thompson, I understand that people make mistakes, but I hope you'll take this as an opportunity to reflect on why you felt the need to make that call in the first place." Margaret nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "I didn't mean any harm," she whispered. I wasn't thinking." James' expression softened. "I believe you, Mrs. Thompson, but it's important that we learn from these moments. Assumptions can have serious consequences, and we all need to do better." As James turned to leave, Margaret called after him. "Chief Wallace," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm truly sorry, and I promise I'll do better." James nodded, offering a small smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. That's all I ask." As he walked back to his house, James felt a mix of emotions: frustration, hope, and determination. This incident was a stark reminder of the biases that still existed, even in a place as seemingly idyllic as Willow Creek. But it was also an opportunity to start a conversation, one that could lead to meaningful change. And James Wallace was determined to lead that conversation, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. A community unveiled. James Wallace sat on his porch the next morning, nursing a cup of black coffee and staring out at the quiet street. It was early, the kind of peaceful moment that most people relish before the world woke up. But James's mind was far from peaceful. The events of the previous day lingered, nagging at him. As much as he wanted to let it go, he couldn't ignore the implications of what had happened. Margaret Thompson's call wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a deeper issue. An issue James had seen play out too many times before. Bias, assumptions, fear. These things didn't just disappear because a town wanted to paint itself as welcoming or progressive. They lingered beneath the surface, surfacing when people felt threatened or uncertain. James sighed and set his mug down. He didn't blame Margaret entirely. She had apologized, and he believed her when she said she would try to do better. But this wasn't just about one person's mistake. It was about the culture of the neighborhood, the assumptions people made about who belonged and who didn't. James had dealt with those assumptions his entire life. But now, as police chief, he had an opportunity to challenge them in a meaningful way. Across the street, Margaret Thompson sat at her kitchen table, staring into her untouched cup of tea. Sleep had evaded her all night. She kept replaying the conversation she'd had with James, his calm yet firm demeanor, and the way he'd addressed her actions without anger. She hated how small and ignorant she'd felt, but more than that, she hated that he was right. She had acted on an assumption, and it had been wrong, terribly wrong. Margaret prided herself on being a good neighbor, someone who looked out for others. But yesterday had shown her a side of herself she didn't want to acknowledge. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing. It was Sarah, the young mother who lived 2 houses down. Margaret hesitated before answering, not sure if she was ready to face anyone yet. "Hello," she said, trying to sound normal. "Margaret, good morning. Did you hear about the new police chief?" Sarah's voice was cheerful, oblivious to Margaret's inner turmoil. "Yes," Margaret replied cautiously. "I met him yesterday. Isn't it exciting? I heard he's already making plans to engage with the community. He's setting up a meet and greet this weekend at the park." Margaret felt a knot in her stomach. "That's nice," she said weakly. "You're coming, right?" Sarah asked. "It's important that we all show up and support him." Margaret paused. She wasn't sure she could face him again so soon, but maybe this was her chance to make amends, not just to James, but to the neighborhood. "Yes," she said finally. "I'll be there." By Saturday morning, the Willow Creek Community Park was buzzing with activity. A canopy tent had been set up near the playground, with folding chairs arranged in a semicircle. A table laden with coffee, donuts, and fruit sat to one side, inviting neighbors to linger and chat. Children darted between the swings and the slide, their laughter carrying over the murmur of adult conversation. James arrived early, dressed casually in a polo shirt and jeans, but his posture and presence still exuded quiet authority. He wanted to make a good impression, but more importantly, he wanted to connect with the people he was sworn to serve. He had planned this event to be informal, a way to break down barriers and foster dialogue. As people trickled in, James greeted each of them with a firm handshake and a warm smile. He recognized a few faces from the neighborhood, including Sarah, who introduced him to her 2 young daughters. "This is Mia and Ella," Sarah said, her voice bright. "They've been so excited to meet you." James crouched slightly to their level, smiling. "Nice to meet you both. Are you enjoying the park today?" Mia, the older of the 2, nodded vigorously. "Mom said you're the boss of the police." James chuckled. "Well, something like that. But my most important job is keeping everyone safe, including you two." Sarah beamed, clearly pleased with the interaction, and moved on to chat with another group of neighbors. Margaret arrived a little later, her nerves jangling. She had spent hours debating whether to come, but she knew she had to face this head-on. Clutching a plate of cookies she had baked that morning, she made her way toward the tent, her eyes scanning the crowd for James. When she spotted him, he was deep in conversation with a group of older residents, his hands gesturing animatedly as he spoke. Margaret hesitated, unsure if she should interrupt. But before she could overthink it, James looked up and caught her eye. "Mrs. Thompson," he called out, smiling warmly. "I'm glad you made it." Margaret's cheeks flushed as she approached. "Good morning, Chief Wallace," she said, holding out the plate of cookies. "I thought I'd bring something to share." James accepted the plate graciously. "Thank you. That's very thoughtful." Margaret hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I also wanted to say thank you for what you said the other day. It made me think. A lot." James nodded, his expression encouraging. "I'm glad to hear that. It's not always easy to confront these things, but it's an important step." "I know," Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly. "And I want to do better. Not just for myself, but for this neighborhood. If there's anything I can do to help, please let me know." James smiled, touched by her sincerity. "You've already taken the first step, Mrs. Thompson, but if you're serious, there's a lot we can do together." As the morning turned into afternoon, James addressed the gathering. He stood under the canopy, the sunlight filtering through the fabric and casting soft shadows across his face. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady and warm. "When I moved to Willow Creek, I was struck by how welcoming this neighborhood seemed, but as you've heard, my first day here wasn't exactly smooth sailing." A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd, and James smiled. "I don't share that to embarrass anyone, but to make a point. Even in the most well-meaning communities, we all have biases, assumptions we make about people before we truly know them. It's human nature, but it's also something we can challenge and change." He paused, letting his words sink in. "As your police chief, my job isn't just to enforce the law. It's to build trust, to foster understanding, and to ensure that everyone in this town feels safe and respected. That starts with conversations like these." James opened the floor to questions and comments, encouraging neighbors to share their thoughts. Some spoke about their excitement for his leadership, while others raised concerns about ongoing issues in the community. Throughout it all, James listened attentively, taking notes and responding thoughtfully. By the time the event wrapped up, the atmosphere had shifted. The initial tension had given way to a sense of camaraderie. People lingered, chatting and laughing, exchanging phone numbers, and making plans to meet up again. Margaret left the park feeling lighter than she had in days. She still had a lot to learn, but for the first time, she felt hopeful. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but it was possible. And it started with her. As James packed up the last of the chairs, Sarah approached him with a bright smile. "I think today was a success," she said. James nodded, looking around at the scattering of neighbors still talking in small groups. "It's a start," he said, "but there's still a lot of work to do." Sarah tilted her head thoughtfully. "Well, you've got the neighborhood talking. That's more than anyone's done in a long time." James smiled. "Talking is good. Now let's see if we can turn those words into action." As he drove home that afternoon, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had moved to Willow Creek hoping for a fresh start, but now he saw an opportunity for something much bigger. This wasn't just about him or Margaret or any one person. It was about creating a community where everyone, regardless of their background, could feel like they truly belonged. And James Wallace was ready to lead the way. The ripple effect. James Wallace woke up the day after the meet and greet with a sense of cautious optimism. The event had gone better than he'd hoped, but he knew the hard work was only beginning. Creating a more inclusive and welcoming community required more than a single gathering. It required persistence, action, and uncomfortable honesty. As he sipped his morning coffee, James reviewed his notes from the previous day. A few neighbors had raised valid concerns about safety and inclusion, but one comment stuck out the most. A young man named Alex had asked, "What can we do to help?" That question sparked an idea. James decided he would form a community action group, a space where residents could come together to discuss issues, learn from each other, and propose real solutions. It wasn't enough for people to talk about change. They needed to be part of it. Later that morning, James sent out a neighborhood-wide email. It read, "Subject: Let's work together. Good morning, Willow Creek neighbors. Thank you again for the warm welcome at yesterday's meet and greet. I left the event inspired by your willingness to engage and listen. Many of you shared concerns and ideas about how we can make our neighborhood stronger, safer, and more inclusive. To build on that momentum, I'm starting the Willow Creek Action Group. This group will meet bi-weekly to discuss topics like community safety, diversity, and ways to better support each other. Our first meeting will be this Thursday at 7 p.m. in the community center. Everyone is welcome, whether you've lived here for decades or just moved in. I look forward to working together to make Willow Creek a place we're all proud to call home. Best regards, Chief James Wallace. James hit send and leaned back in his chair, wondering how the neighborhood would respond. Across the street, Margaret Thompson read the email with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. She had resolved to do better, and joining this group felt like the next step. Still, the idea of confronting her own biases in front of her neighbors made her stomach churn. "I have to go," she muttered to herself. "If I don't, what kind of example am I setting?" Margaret forwarded the email to her book club, adding a note. "This sounds like something we should all be a part of. Let's go together." By Thursday evening, the community center was bustling with energy. Rows of chairs were arranged in a large circle, and James stood at the front, greeting neighbors as they trickled in. He was pleased to see a diverse turnout. Young families, older couples, and even a few teenagers. Margaret arrived with 3 members of her book club in tow, clutching a notebook as though she were attending a class. At 7 p.m. sharp, James stepped into the center of the circle and raised his hands for attention. The murmurs of conversation died down, and all eyes turned to him. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice warm but authoritative. "This is exactly what I hoped for when I sent that email. I see a lot of familiar faces, but also some new ones, which is great. This group is about collaboration, and every voice here matters." He gestured to a large whiteboard behind him. "Tonight, I want us to start by identifying the issues we think are holding our community back. Let's talk openly about what we see, what we feel, and what we want to change." A hand shot up immediately. It belonged to Sarah, the young mother who had been one of the first to support James's efforts. "I think we need to address the assumptions we make about people," she said. "I'll admit, I caught myself making snap judgments, and it's something I want to work on." James nodded. "Thank you, Sarah. That's a great starting point. Anyone else?" Rick, an older man who had lived in Willow Creek for decades, cleared his throat. "I've been here a long time, and I've seen this neighborhood change. For the most part, it's been for the better, but I think there's still this fear of the unknown. People don't always take the time to get to know each other." "That's true," Margaret chimed in, surprising even herself. "And sometimes that fear leads to actions that hurt others. I know because I've been guilty of it." The room went quiet, and all eyes turned to her. Margaret felt her cheeks burn, but she pressed on. "I'm the one who called the police on Chief Wallace when he moved in," she admitted. "I was wrong, and I've apologized. But I know that's not enough. I want to do better, and I hope we all can." James smiled at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you for sharing that, Mrs. Thompson. It takes courage to admit when we've made mistakes, and you're right, change isn't about one apology. It's about ongoing effort." He turned back to the group. "What Margaret just shared is exactly why we're here. We all have biases, whether we realize it or not. The important thing is to recognize them, challenge them, and grow from them." The discussion continued for over an hour, with neighbors sharing their experiences and ideas. Some proposed practical solutions, like organizing block parties to foster better relationships. Others suggested workshops on diversity and inclusion, or volunteer opportunities to support underserved communities in the area. As the meeting wrapped up, James asked everyone to write down one commitment they were willing to make, something they could do to contribute to a more inclusive neighborhood. The responses ranged from simple promises to introduce themselves to new neighbors, to more ambitious plans for organizing educational events. The following weeks saw the action group grow in both size and influence. Each meeting brought new faces, new ideas, and new energy. James was impressed by how quickly the group began to take ownership of the process. Margaret, in particular, had transformed from hesitant participant to vocal advocate, even spearheading a neighborhood newsletter to keep everyone informed about upcoming events and initiatives. One evening, as James was walking home from a meeting, he spotted a group of kids playing basketball in the park. Among them was a boy named Jamal, who had recently moved to Willow Creek with his mother. James had met them during one of his patrols and knew they were struggling to feel accepted. Mind if I join? James asked, walking onto the court. The kids looked at him, wide-eyed. You play basketball? One of them asked skeptically. James laughed. I might be a little rusty, but I think I can keep up. For the next half hour, James played alongside the kids, showing off a surprisingly good jump shot and earning their respect. By the end of the game, Jamal was laughing and joking with his new friends, and James felt a swell of pride. Small moments like this, he knew, could make a big difference. Back at home, James received a call from Margaret. Chief Wallace, she began, her voice brimming with excitement. I just wanted to tell you. We've organized a block party for next weekend. Everyone's pitching in, and we've even invited a few families from nearby neighborhoods. That's fantastic, Mrs. Thompson, James said, genuinely moved. You've done an incredible job. It's not just me, she replied. This whole neighborhood is starting to come together, and it's because of you. James shook his head. It's because of all of us. I just gave the first push. As he hung up, James felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The ripple effect was spreading, touching lives in ways he hadn't even anticipated. Change was slow, but it was happening. And for the first time, he felt like Willow Creek truly was becoming a place where everyone could belong. Bridging the divide. The warm glow of a late spring sunset blanketed Willow Creek as preparations for the block party went into full swing. Tables laden with potluck dishes stretched along the cul-de-sac, their bright tablecloths fluttering in the breeze. Children darted between balloons and streamers, laughing as they tossed water balloons and chalked colorful designs on the pavement. The smell of grilled burgers and hot dogs mingled with the sweet aroma of freshly baked cookies. James Wallace stood to the side, taking it all in. He had attended his fair share of neighborhood events over the years, but there was something different about this one. This wasn't just a gathering of people who happened to live near each other. It felt like a genuine community, one that was beginning to embrace its diversity. Margaret Thompson bustled over, clutching a clipboard and looking more energized than James had ever seen her. Chief Wallace, she called, waving him over. We've got everything ready. Music, food, games. I even convinced Rick to dust off his guitar for a little live entertainment. James smiled warmly. You've outdone yourself, Mrs. Thompson. This is incredible. Margaret flushed with pride. I couldn't have done it without everyone pitching in. And honestly, this has been good for me. I'm learning so much about my neighbors. Things I never took the time to learn before. As Margaret hurried off to organize another activity, James felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Sarah standing there with her two daughters, Mia and Ella, who were holding plates piled high with cookies. We thought we'd bring you a peace offering, Sarah said with a grin, nodding to the cookies. You've been working hard lately. James laughed, crouching to accept the plates from the girls. Thanks, ladies. I'll make sure these don't go to waste. Sarah's expression turned more serious as she lowered her voice. You know, Chief, this party isn't just a party. It's a big step. People are really starting to come together. Even Rick. He told me he'd never imagined himself attending something like this, let alone playing guitar at it. James nodded thoughtfully. It's amazing what happens when people start seeing each other as individuals instead of categories. That's what community is all about. As the evening progressed, James found himself at the center of various conversations. He spoke with Jamal's mother, Aisha, who expressed her gratitude for how welcoming the neighborhood had become. It wasn't easy at first, she admitted, but I think people are starting to open their minds. And Jamal's been so happy lately. He talks about his new friends all the time. That's what I like to hear, James said warmly. Kids are often the first to adapt. They don't carry the same baggage as adults. He also spent time with Rick, who, true to Margaret's word, had brought his guitar and was now leading a group of neighbors in a cheerful sing-along. Between songs, Rick confided in James. You know, Chief, I was hesitant about all this at first. Change isn't easy when you've been set in your ways for so long. But seeing how this neighborhood has come alive, it's made me think. Maybe it's never too late to learn and grow. James clapped Rick on the shoulder. It's never too late, Rick. And the fact that you're here, participating, speaks volumes. You're helping lead the way. As night fell, fairy lights strung between houses cast a soft, inviting glow over the street. Neighbors settled into folding chairs and picnic blankets, chatting and laughing as the day's activities wound down. Margaret took the makeshift stage, a small platform borrowed from the community center, and called for everyone's attention. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "First of all, I want to thank all of you for making this block party such a success. When we started planning this, I wasn't sure how it would turn out. But looking around tonight, I see something truly special, a neighborhood that's starting to feel like family." She paused, scanning the crowd. "I also want to take a moment to acknowledge someone who's been instrumental in bringing us together. Chief Wallace, you've shown us what it means to lead with grace and determination. You've inspired us to look at ourselves, to ask hard questions, and to be better. Thank you for everything you've done, and for everything you continue to do." The crowd erupted into applause, and James felt a lump rise in his throat. He wasn't used to being the center of attention in this way, but he appreciated the sentiment. When the applause died down, James stepped onto the platform. "Thank you, Margaret," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "And thank you to all of you. This block party is proof that change is possible when people come together with open hearts and open minds. But let's not stop here. Let's keep building on this momentum. Let's make Willow Creek a place where everyone feels like they belong, not just for a day, but for the long haul." As the night wore on, James mingled with his neighbors, feeling a sense of connection he hadn't anticipated when he first moved in. He watched as Margaret chatted animatedly with Aisha, as Sarah's daughters played tag with Jamal, as Rick strummed his guitar while a group of teens gathered around him. It wasn't perfect. There were still challenges to address, biases to unlearn, and bridges to build. But for the first time, James felt like they were on the right path. This block party wasn't just a celebration. It was a turning point. The next morning, James awoke to a flurry of emails and messages from neighbors thanking him for his leadership and asking how they could stay involved. Inspired, he decided to launch a series of initiatives through the Willow Creek Action Group, including workshops on bias and cultural understanding, volunteer projects to support underserved communities, and monthly events to foster deeper connections among neighbors. James also made a point of reaching out to the local schools, offering to speak with students about leadership, inclusion, and the importance of embracing diversity. He knew that lasting change started with the younger generation, and he was determined to be a role model for them. Weeks turned into months, and the ripple effects of the block party continued to spread. The neighborhood newsletter, now spearheaded by Margaret, became a platform for residents to share stories, ideas, and resources. Sarah started a parenting group focused on teaching children empathy and acceptance. Rick organized regular jam sessions at the park, drawing people from all walks of life. Even Jamal, once shy and uncertain, had blossomed into a confident young leader. He started a youth group that brought together kids from different neighborhoods, fostering friendships that transcended boundaries. Through it all, James remained a steady presence, guiding, supporting, and inspiring his neighbors. He knew there was still work to be done, but he also knew that change didn't happen overnight. It happened one conversation, one connection, one act of kindness at a time. And in Willow Creek, those small acts were adding up to something extraordinary. Confronting resistance, as the summer days grew longer, Willow Creek continued its journey toward becoming a more inclusive and united community. The block party had ignited a spark, and many neighbors were eager to build on its success. Yet, as James Wallace knew all too well, change, especially change that challenged deep-seated assumptions, was rarely smooth or without resistance. The first sign of pushback came in the form of a letter delivered to the community center. James read it late one afternoon, seated at his desk as sunlight streamed through the windows. The letter, unsigned and typed in terse, blocky font, expressed discontent with the recent direction of the neighborhood. It accused James and the Willow Creek Action Group of fostering division by emphasizing issues of race and inclusion. Focus on keeping the streets safe, not turning us into some political experiment, the letter concluded. James leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He had expected resistance, but the anonymity of the letter bothered him. Whoever wrote it didn't feel comfortable speaking openly, which suggested a deeper fear of change, of being wrong, or of losing a sense of control. James folded the letter and placed it in a file labeled Community Feedback. It wasn't the first piece of criticism he had received, and it wouldn't be the last. Later that evening, James attended the biweekly meeting of the Willow Creek Action Group, held in the community center's main hall. The meetings had grown to include over 30 regular attendees, a mix of ages, backgrounds, and perspectives. As James walked in, he noticed Margaret Thompson and Sarah chatting near the coffee station, their laughter cutting through the usual pre-meeting murmur. He smiled, grateful for their unwavering support. When the meeting began, James addressed the group. "First, I want to thank everyone for your continued commitment to this effort," he said. "The progress we've made as a community has been inspiring. But I also want to acknowledge that not everyone is on board with the changes we're pursuing. We've received some criticism, some of it constructive, some less so." He hesitated, scanning the room. "I want us to use this as an opportunity to reflect. How do we engage with those who are resistant? How do we ensure that this movement isn't just for those who already agree with us, but includes those who might be skeptical or fearful?" The room was quiet for a moment before Rick raised his hand. "I'll admit, I wasn't fully on board when all this started," he said. "But what changed my mind was seeing people take the time to listen to me. Not judge me, but really listen. Maybe that's what we need to focus on. Conversations, not confrontations." Margaret nodded. "I agree. When I made that terrible mistake with Chief Wallace, he didn't call me out or make me feel small. He showed me grace. That made all the difference." Sarah added, "I think we also need to create more opportunities for people to participate in small ways. Not everyone is ready to jump into a big group discussion. Maybe we can organize one-on-one coffee chats or smaller neighborhood circles where people feel less intimidated." James listened carefully, taking notes. "These are great ideas," he said. "Let's start planning some smaller gatherings and see how we can bring more people into the fold." The next week, James began implementing the group's ideas. He reached out to neighbors who hadn't attended any meetings or events, inviting them to informal chats over coffee or lunch. Some were open and curious, while others were guarded, even defensive. But James approached each conversation with patience and empathy, determined to understand their perspectives. One such conversation was with Tom, a retired factory worker who had lived in Willow Creek for over 40 years. Tom's initial demeanor was gruff, his arms crossed as he sat across from James at the local diner. "I don't see why we need all this talk about race," Tom said bluntly. "I've lived here my whole life, and I'd never had a problem with anyone." James nodded thoughtfully. "I understand where you're coming from, Tom. And I'm not saying you've done anything wrong. But sometimes the issues we're addressing aren't as visible to everyone. For example, imagine you're walking into a room where most people don't look like you or know you. How would that feel?" Tom shifted uncomfortably. "I guess it might feel different." "Exactly," James said. "And that's the point. It's not about blame. It's about making sure everyone feels like they belong, no matter their background. We all want the same thing, a safe, welcoming neighborhood. This is just about making sure we're intentional about getting there." By the end of the conversation, Tom was still hesitant, but he agreed to attend the next meeting. "I can't promise I'll agree with everything," he said gruffly, "but I'll listen." "That's all I ask," James replied with a smile. Meanwhile, Margaret spearheaded an effort to expand the neighborhood newsletter. Under her leadership, the newsletter began featuring personal stories from residents, including profiles of new neighbors, updates on local events, and reflections on the community's progress. One story, written by Aisha, described her experience moving to Willow Creek and how the community's openness had helped her and Jamal feel at home. "I cried when I read it," Margaret admitted to James during one of their planning sessions. "It made me realize how much of a difference we're making." Not everyone was receptive to these efforts, however. During a neighborhood association meeting, James encountered vocal criticism from a small but vocal group of residents who felt the initiatives were unnecessary or divisive. "We've always been a good neighborhood," one man argued. "Why fix something that isn't broken?" James responded calmly, "I'm not saying Willow Creek is broken. I'm saying there's always room to grow. By addressing these issues, we're making sure our community remains strong and welcoming for generations to come." The tension in the room was palpable, but James didn't back down. He knew these conversations were vital, even when they were uncomfortable. Over the next month, the Willow Creek Action Group launched a series of small-scale events designed to foster dialogue and connection. One particularly impactful initiative was a neighbor swap, where residents were paired with someone they didn't know well and encouraged to spend an afternoon together. Some pairs went on walks, others shared meals, and a few even tackled home improvement projects. Margaret was paired with Aisha, and the two spent a Saturday morning baking cookies in Margaret's kitchen. As they worked, they talked about their lives, their families, and their hopes for the future. "I wish I'd gotten to know you sooner," Margaret said, her voice tinged with regret. "I've missed out on so much by staying in my little bubble." "It's never too late," Aisha replied with a smile. "And for what it's worth, I think what you're doing now is amazing." By the time fall arrived, the changes in Willow Creek were undeniable. The neighborhood felt more connected, more vibrant, and more inclusive. The resistance hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had softened as people saw the tangible benefits of the community's efforts. James knew the work was far from over. There would always be challenges, setbacks, and new issues to address. But as he walked through the neighborhood one crisp October morning, watching children play and neighbors greet each other warmly, he felt a deep sense of pride. Willow Creek was becoming the kind of place he had always envisioned, not perfect, but striving. And that, James thought, was the true measure of progress. A test of unity. The first chill of autumn crept into Willow Creek, painting the trees in shades of amber and crimson. The transformation mirrored the ongoing changes within the neighborhood. Connections were deepening, and neighbors who had once kept to themselves now stopped to chat on their morning walks. Yet the progress made in fostering inclusivity and understanding was about to face its greatest test. One October morning, James Wallace sat at his kitchen table, reviewing the agenda for the upcoming Willow Creek Action Group meeting. His phone buzzed with an incoming call from Sarah. "Good morning, Sarah," James greeted her warmly. "What's on your mind?" Her voice was tight with concern. "Chief Wallace, have you seen the news?" James frowned. "Not yet. What's going on?" "There's been an incident at the high school," Sarah said. "Some students were caught on video harassing another student, Jamal. The video's everywhere now, and people are furious. But it's already stirring up tension." James felt a wave of anger and sadness wash over him. Jamal was a bright, compassionate boy who had blossomed since moving to Willow Creek. The idea that he had been targeted was infuriating, but the implications for the community were even more troubling. "I'll look into it right away," James assured her. "Thank you for letting me know." James arrived at the high school within the hour, meeting with the principal, Ms. Caroline Mendoza, in her office. She was a stern but empathetic woman who had always supported James's efforts to improve the neighborhood. "We're handling the situation as swiftly as possible," Ms. Mendoza said. "The students involved have been suspended, and we're scheduling a meeting with their parents." James nodded. "That's a good start, but this goes deeper than discipline. We need to address the underlying attitudes that led to this." Ms. Mendoza sighed. "I agree. The video has sparked a lot of discussion, some constructive, some not. It's clear that we have a lot of work to do. "Let me help," James offered. "We can organize a town hall meeting to bring students, parents, and community members together. This isn't just a school issue, it's a community issue." Ms. Mendoza agreed, and the two began planning the event. By the time the town hall meeting was announced, the video had become a flashpoint for discussion throughout Willow Creek. The footage, which showed Jamal being shoved and mocked by a group of older students, had gone viral on social media. While many neighbors expressed outrage and support for Jamal, others downplayed the incident, labeling it as kids being kids. The divide was stark, and James knew that addressing it would require patience, empathy, and careful leadership. The town hall was held in the high school gymnasium, which was packed with students, parents, and other residents. The air was thick with tension as James stepped onto the stage, flanked by Ms. Mendoza and a panel of community leaders. "Good evening," James began, his voice calm but firm. "Thank you all for being here tonight. The incident at the high school has brought to light issues that we cannot ignore. It's not enough to react to what happened. We need to understand why it happened and how we can prevent it from happening again." He paused, scanning the crowd. "This isn't about assigning blame. It's about taking responsibility as a community. Every one of us, students, parents, teachers, and neighbors, has a role to play in creating an environment where everyone feels safe and valued." Jamal's mother, Aisha, spoke next, her voice trembling with emotion. "When we moved to Willow Creek, we hoped for a fresh start, a place where my son could thrive without fear of being judged or excluded. For the most part, this community has been wonderful. But what happened to Jamal shows that there's still work to do. We can't let this divide us. We need to come together." Her words were met with a mix of applause and murmurs, reflecting the crowd's divided opinions. James stepped back in, facilitating a discussion that allowed people to share their thoughts while maintaining respect and decorum. Among those who spoke was Margaret Thompson, who had become one of the most vocal advocates for inclusion in the neighborhood. "This isn't just about Jamal," she said, her voice steady but impassioned. "This is about all of us. If one child in our community feels unsafe or unwelcome, then we've failed as neighbors. It's time to stop making excuses and start making changes." Her words seemed to resonate, sparking a ripple of nods and murmurs of agreement. Even those who had initially dismissed the incident began to reconsider their stance. Over the next few weeks, the community rallied around Jamal and his family. The Willow Creek Action Group launched a series of initiatives aimed at addressing bullying and promoting empathy among students. Workshops on cultural understanding were held at the high school, led by local educators and community members, including James. One workshop featured an activity where students wrote anonymous letters to someone they had judged unfairly or misunderstood. Jamal participated, writing a heartfelt letter to his peers about how the incident had affected him. His letter was read aloud during the session, prompting tears and apologies from several students who had participated in the bullying. Meanwhile, James worked closely with the parents of the students involved in the incident. Some were defensive at first, unwilling to acknowledge their children's actions. But through persistent dialogue, James helped them see the importance of accountability and growth. "I'm not here to punish anyone," James told them. "I'm here to help. We all make mistakes, but it's how we respond to those mistakes that defines us." Slowly, progress was made. The students involved in the bullying apologized to Jamal in person and participated in restorative justice sessions facilitated by the school. The sessions focused on empathy, understanding, and rebuilding trust. The experience proved to be a turning point for Willow Creek. The incident, while painful, became a catalyst for deeper reflection and action. Neighbors who had once been indifferent to issues of inclusion began to take a more active role in fostering a welcoming community. Parents started having honest conversations with their children about kindness and respect, while the high school introduced ongoing programs to address bias and bullying. Jamal, despite the trauma he had endured, emerged stronger and more confident. He became a leader among his peers, advocating for empathy and inclusion. With the support of his family, friends, and neighbors, he turned his pain into purpose. On a crisp November evening, the neighborhood gathered at the park for a candlelight vigil, organized by the Willow Creek Action Group. The vigil was a celebration of resilience and unity, with speeches, music, and moments of silence to reflect on the journey the community had undertaken. James stood near the front, watching as neighbors of all backgrounds mingled and connected. Margaret approached him, holding a candle that flickered in the gentle breeze. "You've done something remarkable here, Chief Wallace," she said. "This neighborhood feels different now, stronger." James shook his head. "We've done it together, Margaret. This isn't about me. It's about all of us." As the vigil continued, James felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The road to unity was long and often challenging, but moments like this reminded him that the journey was worth it. Willow Creek was far from perfect, but it was growing, healing, and becoming a place where everyone could belong. And for James, that was the true definition of community. A community transformed. Winter settled over Willow Creek, blanketing the neighborhood in soft snow and a quiet calm. Yet beneath the surface, the community buzzed with energy and determination. The challenges they had faced over the past months had forged bonds stronger than anyone could have anticipated, and there was a collective resolve to keep moving forward. James Wallace sat in his living room, reviewing plans for the next phase of the Willow Creek Action Group's initiatives. The group had grown significantly, and its impact had extended beyond the neighborhood, drawing attention from surrounding communities. Schools, civic organizations, and even local businesses had reached out, eager to learn from Willow Creek's example. The progress was encouraging, but James knew they couldn't afford to grow complacent. There was always more work to be done. One cold January morning, James received a call from Ms. Caroline Mendoza, the high school principal. "Chief Wallace, we've got something big happening," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "The students want to host a diversity summit. They've been inspired by everything that's happened, and they want to take the lead." James's heart swelled with pride. "That's fantastic, Ms. Mendoza. How can I help?" "They're hoping you'll be a keynote speaker," she said. "And of course, we'd love your input on the planning process." James agreed without hesitation, already imagining the impact such an event could have. He had always believed that true change required the involvement of young people, and this summit was proof that the next generation was ready to take up the mantle. The weeks leading up to the summit were a whirlwind of activity. Students worked tirelessly to plan workshops, panel discussions, and cultural showcases. They collaborated with teachers, parents, and community members, drawing on the collective wisdom of Willow Creek to create an event that would inspire and educate. Jamal played a central role in the planning process, emerging as a natural leader. He proposed a workshop on restorative justice, sharing his own experiences as both a victim of bullying and an advocate for change. His courage and authenticity earned him admiration from peers and adults alike. Margaret Thompson also became heavily involved, volunteering to coordinate logistics and recruit speakers. "I never thought I'd be doing something like this," she confided to James during one of their planning meetings. "But it feels right, like I'm finally contributing to something bigger than myself." "You're doing amazing work, Margaret," James said. "This summit wouldn't be possible without people like you." The day of the summit arrived, bringing together students, parents, educators, and residents from Willow Creek and beyond. The high school gymnasium had been transformed into a vibrant space filled with colorful banners, informational booths, and displays celebrating the diverse cultures represented in the community. James stood near the entrance, greeting attendees as they arrived. He was struck by the diversity of the crowd, families of different backgrounds, elders mingling with teenagers, and even a few reporters who had caught wind of the event. Jamal approached him, looking both nervous and excited. "Chief Wallace, do you think people will really listen to us?" he asked. James placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "Jamal, you've already made people listen. This summit is proof of that. Trust yourself. You've got something important to say." The summit began with James's keynote address. He stood on the stage. The gymnasium hushed as hundreds of faces turned toward him. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice steady and warm. "Today is a testament to what's possible when a community comes together. When I first moved to Willow Creek, I didn't know what to expect. But what I found here is a group of people willing to learn, to grow, and to face uncomfortable truths with courage and humility." He paused, letting his words sink in. This summit isn't just about celebrating diversity. It's about understanding it. It's about recognizing the value of every individual, no matter their background, and creating a space where everyone can thrive. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with conversations like these. The audience erupted into applause, and James stepped back, letting the students take center stage. Throughout the day, attendees participated in a variety of workshops and discussions. One session, led by Jamal and a group of his peers, explored the impact of stereotypes and the importance of empathy. Using role-playing exercises and personal stories, they encouraged participants to challenge their own biases and think critically about how they treated others. Another workshop, facilitated by Margaret and Aisha, focused on building stronger connections within the neighborhood. They shared practical strategies for fostering inclusivity, such as hosting cultural potlucks, organizing volunteer projects, and creating spaces for open dialogue. The cultural showcase was a highlight of the event, featuring performances, art displays, and food from different traditions. It was a celebration of the richness that diversity brought to Willow Creek and a reminder of the shared humanity that united everyone. As the summit drew to a close, Jamal took the stage to deliver the final remarks. His voice trembled at first, but he quickly found his rhythm. "When we moved here, I didn't know if I'd fit in," he admitted. "I was scared that people wouldn't accept me for who I am. And for a while, that fear felt real. But over the past few months, I've seen this community change. I've seen people stand up for what's right and work to make things better. That's what this summit is about, showing that we can grow, that we can be better." Tears filled Aisha's eyes as the audience gave Jamal a standing ovation. James couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. This young man, who had endured so much, was now a beacon of hope for the entire community. In the weeks following the summit, the momentum it created continued to ripple through Willow Creek. The event had sparked new initiatives, including mentorship programs for students, cross-cultural exchanges, and partnerships with neighboring towns. The lessons learned at the summit were being put into action, shaping the future of the community. Margaret, reflecting on the journey, shared her thoughts with James during a neighborhood meeting. "I used to think change was impossible," she said, "but now I see it's not about perfection. It's about progress. And that's something we can all work toward." James nodded, his heart full. "You're right, Margaret. Progress is what matters. And together, we're proving that it's possible." As spring approached, the snow melted away, revealing a neighborhood transformed, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. Willow Creek wasn't perfect, but it was stronger, more connected, and more committed to its values than ever before. James stood on his porch one evening, watching as neighbors chatted and children played in the fading light. He knew there would always be challenges ahead, but he also knew this community was ready to face them, together. And for James Wallace, that was the greatest victory of all. The new foundation. Spring arrived in Willow Creek with its familiar symphony of renewal, budding flowers, the soft hum of lawnmowers, and the laughter of children playing in the streets. But this spring felt different. It wasn't just the season that had changed. It was the neighborhood itself. The work of the past year had created something extraordinary, a community that no longer feared difficult conversations but embraced them. A place where differences weren't just tolerated but celebrated. James Wallace often marveled at how far Willow Creek had come. Yet he knew that progress was a fragile thing, always requiring vigilance, care, and commitment. One Saturday morning, James stood in front of a crowd gathered at the park for the unveiling of Willow Creek's newest project, a community center expansion. The addition, funded by a mix of grants and local fundraising, would include a dedicated space for cultural education, youth programs, and community events. Margaret Thompson, now a leading voice in the neighborhood, stood beside James at the podium. She had become one of his closest allies, a living example of how change could happen at any age. "Good morning, everyone," James began, his deep voice carrying across the crowd. "When I first moved to Willow Creek, I had no idea what to expect. What I found was a community with incredible potential, a community ready to confront its challenges and grow together." He gestured to the new building behind him. "This expansion isn't just about bricks and mortar. It's about creating a space where everyone feels welcome, where every voice matters, and where we can continue the important work of building a better future." Margaret took the microphone next, her hands trembling slightly. "A year ago, I made a mistake, one I'm not proud of. But that mistake led me to a journey of self-discovery and growth. This community taught me that it's never too late to change, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be part of something bigger than myself." The audience erupted into applause, and Margaret stepped back, tears glistening in her eyes. James placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, proud of the woman she had become. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was followed by a day-long celebration, complete with food, music, and activities for all ages. Jamal, now a confident and charismatic teenager, led a group of his friends in a spoken-word performance that brought the crowd to its feet. His poem, titled "A Place to Belong," captured the spirit of the community's journey. "They said we were different, but aren't we the same? We all seek acceptance, not judgment or blame. This place, our home, it's more than just land. It's hearts that unite, it's neighbors who stand." Aisha, watching from the sidelines, wiped away tears as she saw her son receive a standing ovation. She turned to James, who was clapping along with the rest of the crowd. "You've given him something priceless," she said. "You've given him hope." James shook his head. "He's the one who gave us hope. Jamal is a reminder of why we're doing this, for the next generation." As the celebration continued, James wandered through the crowd, speaking with neighbors new and old. He stopped by the booth where Sarah was helping her daughters paint flower pots for the community garden. "Chief Wallace," Mia called out, waving excitedly. "Look what we made." She held up a brightly painted pot adorned with the words "Grow Together." James knelt to examine it, a smile spreading across his face. "That's beautiful, Mia, and it's the perfect message for today." Sarah beamed. "The girls have been so inspired by everything happening in the neighborhood. It's amazing to see how much they've learned about kindness and inclusion." James nodded. "That's the goal. If we can teach them now, they'll carry these lessons with them for the rest of their lives." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the celebration transitioned into a quiet, reflective gathering around a fire pit. Neighbors shared stories about the past year, moments of growth, challenges overcome, and connections made. Rick, the retired factory worker who had once been skeptical of the community's efforts, played his guitar softly in the background. When it was James's turn to speak, he stood and gazed at the circle of faces illuminated by the firelight. "I want to thank all of you," he began, his voice filled with emotion. "This journey hasn't been easy, and there were times when I wondered if we could truly make a difference. But every one of you proved that change is possible. You've shown what it means to be a community, not just a group of people living near each other, but a family." He paused, looking at Jamal, Margaret, Sarah, and the others who had become part of this incredible transformation. "This isn't the end of our work. It's the foundation for something even greater. And I have no doubt that together, we'll continue to build a future we can all be proud of." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, the sound echoing into the night. In the weeks that followed, the new community center became a hub of activity. It hosted workshops on cultural awareness, after-school programs for kids, and regular meetings of the Willow Creek Action Group. The center's library featured books on diversity and inclusion, many of which had been donated by neighbors. Jamal started a mentorship program for younger students, sharing his story and helping them navigate challenges with confidence and resilience. Margaret launched a book club that explored themes of empathy and social justice, drawing participants from across the neighborhood. And James, he continued to lead with grace and humility, always looking for new ways to strengthen the community. Whether it was helping to organize a charity drive, mediating a neighborhood dispute, or simply stopping to chat with residents during his patrols, he remained a steady and inspiring presence. One quiet evening, James sat on his porch, watching the streetlights flicker on. The neighborhood was peaceful, but it was a peace earned through effort, understanding, and collaboration. Margaret walked by, carrying a basket of flowers she had picked from the community garden. She waved and called out, "Good evening, Chief Wallace." "Evening, Margaret," James replied with a smile. As she disappeared around the corner, James leaned back in his chair and took a deep breath. Willow Creek wasn't perfect, no place ever was, but it was a community that had faced its challenges head-on and come out stronger. It was a place where people cared for one another, where they listened and learned, and where they refused to let fear or prejudice dictate their actions. For James Wallace, that was more than enough. And as the stars began to twinkle above, he allowed himself to dream of all the possibilities still ahead.